Today you're about to know the top 5 best attacking plans in the most common chess opening, the Italian game. The Italian game comes off the first move pawn to e4, and as your opponent responds symmetrically, you then go knight to f3, hitting the central pawn, black defends it, and then you bring your bishop out to c4 to this active square where it possibly targets your opponent's king. Now in this position your opponent will usually either go bishop c5 or knight f6, but it doesn't really matter as the position remains to be more or less the same and the plans will be the same just as well. Let's say your opponent goes bishop to c5 and you continue with pawn to c3, getting ready to play pawn to d4 somewhere in the future. Now there are different ways for black to go about this. Sometimes they play a move pawn to h6 because they're worried about you going knight to g5 and targeting this weakness on f7, somewhat similar to the fried sliver attack. In fact, h6 is a waste of time, but still it allows us to see one of the interesting plans of white, which is kind of underrated and overlooked by many. We know that c3 is preparing this move pawn to d4, and of course in many variations you will indeed play it. But on top of that, you also have one more idea which your opponent is very likely to overlook. The same pawn on c3 also enables you to push in the queen side with the move pawn to b4, where you start to drive away this bishop from here, plus as the bishop goes back, you can then keep pushing pawns forward and keep chasing these queen side pieces. You can either push the a pawn forward, and from there you can attack one of these two minor pieces on the next move, or you can just keep pushing forward with the b pawn right away with the move pawn to b5. This time you're attacking the knight, has to go, and like the inconvenience for black is that so far the knight defended this pawn on e5, and as the knight goes away, you'll be free to just pick up the pawn. For example, if the knight goes to a5, I mean, it's already quite a good thing for you because you push these pieces to the queen side, to the edge of the board where they're not very active, and now you can actually transition to the quick attack on the other side of the board, on the king side. And you can knock the door to the black's king with bishop takes f7, just calling the king out. And as the king goes out, then you continue with knight takes e5, you pick up that pawn, plus you deliver a check to the king. And all of a sudden you actually win within just a couple of moves with this strange queenside push, which your opponent totally unexpected. Now what can your opponent do? If the king goes either to f8 or e7, one of these two squares, you can follow up with knight to g6, which is a fork to the king and the rook. Thus you picked up this pawn on e5. On the next move you'll grab the rook on h8 and you keep attacking his vulnerable king, so that should be easily winning by white. So let's take it back. And if the king goes instead of these two squares somewhere to e8, then you follow up with queen h5 check and you end up with something similar to Scholar's checkmate. If the king moves somewhere, he can continue attacking in various different ways. It's easily winning for white. For example, bishop a3, another way for white to deliver a check, and after d6 you finish it off with queen to f7, indeed something very close to Scholar's checkmate. Okay, we're moving on to the plan number 2. This time black did not play h6 but played the correct move knight to f6, developing a knight plus attacking this pawn on e4. And although the main move is pawn to d4, it leads to a complicated game with a lot of variations that you need to memorize, so I actually recommend that you opt for a bit modest looking move pawn to d3, but there are still very aggressive plans that you can employ later on. We're going to cover them in today's video. And sometimes your opponent will be deceived by, seemingly passive nature of this move pawn to d3. He'll think that you play passively and he'll wish to strike in this area himself with pawn to d5. It actually turns out to be a big error. After an exchange on d5, you can strangely enough follow up with queen to b3, and this is something that your opponent totally overlooked. Now, you're attacking this knight on d5 and it can't really go away, as in this case you'll grab this pawn on f7 and attack his king, which will be deadly for him. So he's kind of left with this really unpleasant situation where he's got to do something with the knight, but it's unclear what to do. If black moves his knight from c6 somehow, either to e7 or a5, trying to hold on to this knight or to counterattack, it doesn't matter. In both cases it loses because you've got a strong counter, queen to b5. This is a check to the king, attack of the bishop, and in this case even an attack of the knight. So definitely on the next move you'll pick up one of black's minor pieces, getting a winning material advantage. So let's take this move back. What else can black possibly play here? If black plays bishop to e6, trying to defend the knight in the most normal looking way, that actually leaves this b7 pawn undefended, as there is no bishop on c8 anymore. You can go ahead and grab the pawn, plus attack this knight on c6. And once again it's inconvenient for black to defend it, because they can't move the queen away, the queen has to keep guarding the rook. If the queen moves, you're going to pick up the rook there in the corner. So what do they do with the knight? If they ever move the knight anywhere, either to e7 or a5, once again it fails to the very same tactics, queen to b5. You slide back, still with this double attack, and on top of the pawn that you grabbed on b7, you're going to gobble up this bishop and once again gain a winning material advantage. Moving on to the plan number 3, which is my favorite one actually. I mean, you can win countless games, especially in Blitz, just following exactly the moves that I'm about to share with you. And the nice thing about this is that this is a plan. Meaning it doesn't matter like what exact moves your opponent is going to try, because the plan will be the same always. So you don't rely on memorization, you just understand the plan and you execute it. So here, let's say our opponent plays some normal looking moves such as pawn to d6. In this case, I recommend that you play a move bishop to b3. It's a bit mysterious looking move, but it makes sense. So first off, you want to save this bishop. It's a pretty active piece which is putting pressure, long term against these squares where your opponent is likely to castle, and it's quite a powerful attacking piece in the Italian game. So you do want to save it. And the problem with black here is that quite often they want to go knight a5 and go after this bishop sooner or later. And therefore, once you drop the bishop back to b3, you always have a nice retreat square. So if your opponent ever tries to attack it, you can always slide back, and this attack was pointless. So that's the first reason for playing bishop to b3. Secondly, you don't have to worry about defense of this bishop if your opponent ever goes bishop b6, tries to attack it or anything. So you kind of overprotect it in advance. And lastly, it's also a very evil awaiting move, because lots of your opponents are living with the delusion that bishop g4 is a really great way to start attacking you on the king side. But we really wait for this move to happen, we welcome it to happen, because that allows you to realize a super aggressive attacking plan on the king side. What if your opponent just doesn't play bishop g4? Well, then you can use the best Italian plan, you just drink your cappuccino and chill. Sooner or later they will, and then you'll beat them. So as soon as they go bishop g4, I recommend that you play h3. Our plan is to actually gain a lot of nice tempos by attacking off this bishop. So play h3, pushing it. And in most cases they are going to drop it back, because that was the main idea of putting the bishop right there, to pin your knight down to the queen. If they trade on f3, that's actually quite cool. I mean, your queen comes out, and it's helpful for your future attack against the king side, as your opponent is likely to castle there. You can follow up with your own move, bishop g5, counter-pinning his knight. And generally speaking, this exchange of your opponent's bishop for your knight is a favorable thing for you. So there's no problem for you, it's actually quite good. In most cases, they'll bring the bishop back. And then what you do is you play knight to d2. Notice that we don't castle. What we have in mind is to maneuver the knight over here to f1 followed by g3 and to chase this bishop. But on top of that, you actually just keep up adding more and more pieces to the king side because you want to attack there. And that's what your opponent doesn't know so far. So he just castles, playing normal moves, you play knight f1. This plan looks kind of weird at first. You don't develop pieces, you horse around with your knight, you play your bishop twice. It looks like white is playing some dubious moves, but in fact it's all very strong, because you've got a very clear plan of attacking opponent's castle and your opponent doesn't know what to do. Sometimes they'll play h6, trying to stop you from going there, bishop g5. If they don't play, it doesn't matter. And then you've got two options. You can either just continue your maneuver with knight to g3, attacking this bishop. We're going to talk about that in a minute. It's also very strong. Or you can just go all out in your kingside attack by starting to march your pawns forward, g4. In both cases, we'll win another tempo, attacking this bishop on h5, which your opponent believed to be an asset for him. Turned out to be that it's the opposite, it's a liability, it's a weakness of his position. The bishop was pushed back, and here again, you can develop your attack gradually, just reposition the knight here to f5 and kind of gradually keep adding more and more pieces to the king side. Or the quickest way is just to push forward with g5 straight away, since this attacks the knight as well as the pawn. And also, let's not forget about our bishop from c1, which is adding more pressure there. It kind of forces them to take, and then our bishop comes off, and it's pretty cool because you also now pin the knight down to the queen, and you start adding more and more pieces closer to his king. Now we've got this one bishop standing there. Let's not forget about the bishop from b3, which is also putting pressure, and indirectly, but it's still helpful. Our knight is ready to jump there to g3 on the next move after almost whatever black does. This pin is unpleasant. There's not much black can do about it. If they try to move the queen away, you can always take it and disrupt their pawns, or you can just not do anything and keep playing like your main moves, knight g3. After that, you have plenty of attacking ideas. You can take over here and, destroy his castling. You can push the h pawn forward, h4, h5, attack this bishop once again, then keep pushing forward with h6. Your rook from h1 will join the attack straight from its starting position, and is deadly. You can also start to jump with your knight, such as knight to h4. For example, if your opponent moves the knight somewhere, instead of taking there, you can just go knight h4. Very common move for all these variations, very strong. From here, you attack this bishop, plus the knight is possibly ready to jump to f5, just to stand closer to your opponent's king. Now also this knight on h5 is under the fire. And if he takes here, again, I mean, the beauty of your position is that you have such a strong dominance on the king side, is that almost any logical move will win. Like you can take here, and you still have your winning attack. You can take here, and you still win. It's even stronger. That's also something that your opponent is highly likely to overlook, because they somewhat forgot about this bishop on b3, which was standing there for a long time, not doing anything, but it was kind of in an ambush. It's still putting pressure here, and it is pinning this pawn so it can't move, and therefore knight cannot be captured there. And if your opponent does something with this knight, you just jump out with your queen forward, and queen h8, and the next move is unstoppable. You're going to checkmate him, his pawn is still pinned. And it kind of makes sense, because if you look at this position, you see that white has a bunch of attacking pieces basically against this lonely king on g8. So it makes sense that your attack worked out so well. And that's how you gradually develop this kingside attack, and your opponent is clueless of what to do, and you just checkmate him. Alright, here's the plan number 4. In this classical position, which you can reach via different move order, we play bishop to b3, which is a useful move to save this bishop from any kind of attacks, and also it's an awaiting move. We rely on your opponent to be aggressive, to try to be aggressive, and to play bishop g4. What if he doesn't? What if he just castles? Well, then you castle as well, and you kind of keep waiting for him to still play bishop g4. After you castled, it feels even better for your opponent to do so, because it feels like he can now try to attack your kingside somehow, because your king is standing there. So you really rely on your opponent to go there, and in most cases they will. Once they do play bishop g4, you tell them what I know many of you guys tell to your every girlfriend: I've been waiting for you my entire life. And you play pawn to h3, attacking this bishop. So you basically realize the exact same plan, just with your king castled, so it makes a little bit of a difference, but not that much. Now the bishop comes back to maintain this pin, and then you start to relocate your knight through the very same route. So you play knight to d2, aiming to go through f1 to g3 and to chase this bishop. Your opponent can do basically whatever he wants, it doesn't matter, you still realize the same plan. If he ever tries d5, guess what? Even that doesn't change anything. You don't take there, you ignore it, you just proceed with your own plan. Now we want our knight to move there, but this square is taken. So we move the rook here to e1, and then we vacate this square for our knight. Plus the rook on e1 is also doing a good job, supporting our pawns. Oh, it's still nice. Let's say your pawn trades in the center of the board, and once again, guess what? That doesn't change anything in your plan. Then he plays some move, let's say pawn to h6. Now, normally we'd wish to move our knight here, but the problem is if you do it right away, he can trade queens. And we do not want that. We want to attack and checkmate your opponent, and after queens come off the board, it's usually hard to checkmate your opponent. So we do want to save our queen. That's why I would just move it here to e2. Then your opponent does something, let's say queen e7, and now you play knight f1, and after your opponent plays some move, you play knight g3, and now our maneuver succeeded, and we attack this bishop, plus our knight is ready to jump there to f5, which is also a really great outpull square. From f5, your knight will attack, like put pressure to lots of squares in your opponent's position. It's a monstrous knight. But right now we're putting pressure to this bishop. If it goes back to g6, now the very standard continuation of your attack is knight h4. As we know, this actually threatens to capture this bishop for nothing. Your opponent cannot recapture because the pawn is pinned down to the king. Therefore, they need to save this bishop from being taken. And if they go bishop to h7, you then keep marching to f5, and finally you landed this beautiful monstrous knight on f5, and you attack his queen on e7. He can try to trade it off, but it doesn't matter because we have the brother supporting us, so knight takes, still attacks the queen. After queen goes somewhere, in these kind of positions, once you landed your knight to f5, plus you have this bishop active, and you have this bishop from c1 also ready to join the party, you see that you have a lot of tactical ideas here. Quite often you can just go ahead and sack the bishop right there for a couple pawns, open up his king completely, and then checkmate him. Another standard way for you to go about things is to bring the queen closer, because usually you finish the attack with a queen, you checkmate your opponent's king with your queen. So you can play queen to f3, and from here you start putting pressure here, and you're possibly ready to play queen g3, threatening queen takes g7 checkmate. So adding your queen usually adds a lot of power to your attack. And if your opponent plays something, sometimes they'll try knight e7, trying to trade off your knight. Of course, we do not want to just trade it off for nothing, we want to attack. And here you have a lot of ways to keep attacking. One of the standard ones is knight takes h6. It's not even a sacrifice because thanks to our queen, we are picking up this pawn on h6, destroying his castling, and as he recaptures, we grab his knight on f6. So we didn't sacrifice anything, in fact, we just won this pawn on g7, plus he's now completely exposed. So with both our bishops ready to join the party, it's all over for black. For example, knight to g6, you can play bishop takes h6 and followed by queen to g7 checkmate. That's one thing. The other thing which they often overlook is once again that you can actually just capture this piece on g6 with a check to the king because the pawn is pinned. Anyway, because they forget about this bishop, they often blunder it. So you can win this way as well. You can see just how strong your attack is, and what I love about this is that you kind of make your opponent feel like a fool because he seemingly plays all the right moves. You think about black. He castled, he developed all his pieces, he played queen and rook to the open file, he seemingly played by the book, did all the correct stuff, but he was destroyed badly and he's completely clueless of what happens. It's just because you had this clear plan of attack, plus your opponent did a big mistake by playing his bishop out to g4 earlier in the game, which gave you a lot of temples for your kingside attack. Alright, finally, what if your opponent never goes bishop g4 at all? He's smart, or just by sheer luck he avoids playing that move. Well, then you can just play bishop g5 yourself. And a lot of your opponents still don't know how to handle it properly. If they don't want to play bishop g4, in most cases they will play bishop e6. Now, there is one thing that you gotta know here, you don't take there. If you're part of the Icor nation, you know that to take is a mistake, and basically you should always think twice before executing an exchange yourself. So if you take there, which I don't recommend, you make a couple good things for black. So this pawn repositions to e6, which first of all covers these two squares so your knight can never go there in the future. And we know that possibly repositioning our knight to f5 is always one of the good attacking plans for you in the Italian game, but no longer. And secondly, once the pawn is there, his rook is active along the f-file, which is quite nice for him. You kind of helped him to activate the rook. Plus this pin is no longer a problem because the rook is defending the knight, so the queen can easily move away. So by taking there on e6, you actually helped him quite a lot, so I do not recommend this. So instead what you do, you just ignore it and you keep playing your moves. You play knight to d2. You still keep in mind that you can possibly reposition the knight in the very same fashion. And quite often your opponent will take on c4, breaking the very same rule to take as a mistake, helping your knight to go forward to a more active square, so you can thank your opponent and know that now you've got some decent advantage. If your opponent ever tries to push your bishop away with h6, that doesn't change anything because you can always play back and maintain the pin. And if your opponent ever goes bold and plays pawn to g5, saying, hey, I don't worry about my king safety, I just want to break the pin, then what I recommend is that you stop being a reputable member of society, go Cosa Nostra mode and just say, hey, the end justifies the means, I'm going to be bold and achieve my goal, whatever it takes. So knight takes g5. I hope that my critics won't take this quote out of the entire lesson, separately. So Igor Smirnov recommends that you stop being a reputable member of society. Yeah, go Cosa Nostra. So as you crush here on g5, you maintain the pin, plus the king is now completely exposed. Yes, you had to sacrifice a piece for 2 pawns, but that's not such a big exchange. After all, you're just down a pawn if we assume that a piece approximately equals 3 pawns. And now he's in troubles, because what can he do? I mean, the knight is pinned. He can't move the queen away, because then he'll just take the knight for nothing. If he tries to defend it somehow, you can also add more pressure by playing queen to f3, putting more pressure. You don't want to trade there, you just want to add more and more pressure until you actually win this knight. So if your opponent plays some move, doesn't matter what, rook h8, whatever, you keep bringing this knight to e3. We know that these f5 squares and sometimes d5 squares are just great for our knight, and we do want to land it there. But our simple plan is like this. We have this knight pinned down to the queen, so we do want to bring our knight there to d5, and then just to take the knight with either a knight or a bishop, and we'll be totally winning. And there is not much your opponent can do. In fact, he's defenseless. If he ever takes on e3, we know that this exchange is actually pretty cool, because you can recapture with a pawn, which adds your rook to the attack. And now he's completely defenseless against this whole pressure. On the next move, you'll take the knight, attack his king, attack the rook, attack the queen, and you either grab half of his material or you checkmate his king, so you win. We just covered how you can crush black, but in case you play this opening as black, then you may be wondering, hey, but what do I do? Is it all hopeless? Of course not, you just gotta know the right way for black. So if you're curious about that, I've got a separate video about the right plan for black, which you can check out right here. Or if you want to improve your positional understanding overall, because that's the essence of chess, feel free to check out this free masterclass by clicking the link over there. Keep crushing it. Ciao.